Okay, we had a little bit of a change in plans. I was gonna talk about one thing. I was actually, yeah, I was over there on that ladder over there. I was putting some stuff away. My wife comes up to me and asked me to help her with some stuff. And then by the time I got done helping her with her stuff, I couldn't remember what it was I've been talking about with your stuff. So, but while I was there, talking to you, taking care of her stuff, I thought of something else that's kind of important. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about bankruptcy. Okay. Let's talk about like what you could do. Like for instance, you could go right now. Let me see. My name is John Hickey, and I mostly lived in New York State. So I did live a little bit in Texas, a little bit in Phoenix, Arizona, and a little bit in Florida. But for the most part, I lived in New York State. I didn't own any businesses when I lived in those other places. So you could go and search for bankruptcies for people like me, John Hickey. I'm about 51 years old. I lived in the Bronx. I lived in Westchester County. I lived in Long Island a little bit. So you could look me up and you could be like, let's see what this guy's got. How many bankruptcies this guy got? You know, there's no shame in bankruptcy. I went to see a bankruptcy lawyer in 2007 for the first time. I was in tough straits, man. I had purchased a house for about 700 grand. And shortly after I bought it, that house was worth about 450. I only put down about 30 grand on that house, so it was mighty appetizing to walk away from that debt obligation, so to speak, and not pay my debt. Look at this. Ooh, look at that nasty mess there. Forgot I put some oranges in the fridge the other day. I haven't opened the garage fridge in a couple of days. Not good, not good. So anyway, I talked to the bankruptcy lawyer about it. I have borrowed some money for some friends to purchase my house. I had some, look at that. That's bad news. I didn't get to eat on my prime rib. And then my wife took me out to 10 restaurants. I got a nice piece of prime rib here. Prime rib. Prime cut of prime rib. Wasted. I can't eat it because it smells bad now. My wife took me to all these restaurants the last 5 days, fancy restaurants. I hate those restaurants. Look at me, I got fat in 5 days. Now I gotta fast. But anyway, so I had borrowed money from friends, from family, from the bank, of course. I had credit cards. I mean, I did about $100,000 worth of renovations on the house after I bought it, and it was still only worth about $450. So this is just a huge problem we're talking about, you know? So I went to see the bankruptcy attorney, and he told me, man, this is easy. How much do you make a year? At the time, I was making about $50,000 a year working for the New York City Fire Department as a fireman. And I was working at a bar. And I could have just quit my job working at the bar, so my income would way down. And then it would be like, you know, wait a month or two, whatever. And then say, well, I'm working a job full time, 48 hours a week, and I make about $50,000 a year. I was a new New York City fireman. I was only in for about a year. So he was like, man, this is just good news for you. He goes, but I want to ask you some questions because sometimes bankruptcy is not appropriate for certain people. And he's like, do you plan on paying any of these people back? And I said, yeah. I mean, that is the plan. He's like, what about the credit cards? Would you pay them back? And I was like, to be honest with you, I would like to pay them all back. And the reason is because I know for a fact that if you see a credit card company with an LLC or with a corporation or whatever, there is going to be a person on the other side of that obligation who doesn't get what they gave to you. You got what you needed, you went to the store and bought some stuff, and you put it up in your house, did whatever you had to do with it, used it for renovations, used it at Home Depot to buy sheetrock, plumbing supplies, whatever it is. Maybe you took yourself on vacation. But whatever it is that you chose, you got what you wanted. Now they're not going to get what they wanted. And I don't really like that. Personally, that's me. So he said, do you feel comfortable with bankruptcy like that? And I was like, to be honest with you, I think what I would do, which I've always done before when I hit a hiccup in personal financial situations, is I go directly to the person, I talk to them and explain what's going on, and then I just wait until time goes by when I can pay them back. A lot of times the best way to do it is to start small, tell them, listen, I'll give you $50 a week. But eventually, you know, when you hit it and you get some cash rolling and you start knocking that debt down, first thing you do. The good thing about doing that is that in your brain tells you that you do this stuff. And when you put on a sheet of paper that you have to make a delivery every week to this person of cash, financially, my experience is the brain solves that problem. Now you might have to come up with $2,000 a month. You might only make $1,500 a month. But because you say to yourself, this is what I gotta do, you write it down on paper, you say I'm gonna pay that guy on next day, usually I'm able to carry through with that. If I don't, I'll contact that person at that time that I know that I'm not gonna meet my obligation. I'll let them know, listen, man, I tried the best I could. I'm gonna come to you with something. And then I let them know. So that has happened to me before, and I found the best way to do it is just approach the person and tell them. Now, why do you wanna do this? I feel like personally, if I didn't do that, then what would happen is I might become a little lazy. I might start just throwing money around like a crazy man and not care what happens with it. So I've always been very cheap with money as far as like, using my resources unwisely. Like I don't really go to stores and buy coffee. I don't buy bottles of water when I leave my house. A lot of times I won't even eat when I leave my house all day or night. I'll come back and I'll just eat at home. So I don't really waste resources. So to me, if I did that, it would be like a waste. I was raised by Depression era people who grew up in the Depression. I'm like, I was born in 1973, but the people who raised me were born in the 30s. So as a result, I have their mentality, like save, do as much as you can on your own, that kind of stuff, pay your debts, that kind of thing. So I ended up just walking out of that lawyer's office that day saying, okay, I'll figure it out. I'm not gonna do debt. And I was missing payments on credit cards, late on my mortgage, had no choice. I gave him whatever I had. And eventually, I'd say within maybe like 2 or 3 years, I paid all the credit cards back, paid all the people back that I owed, paid everybody back except the bank. And I had, the bank started adding onto my mortgage payments because they, I don't know what they call it, but they basically did, I don't know what they call it, but I did not make my obligations. So they just said what they call a workaround, I think they call it. They said, well, you just keep paying what you can pay for the moment so we don't, foreclose. And as long as you keep up with this payment schedule, we'll work the rest of it out. And then within a few years, I was able to refi at a lower rate. When I got that refi going, boom, everything got a lot better. And I was able to refi with that bank because I had paid off all the credit card companies, because I had letters. One of the other reasons too was that the property was worth a lot more by then. I went to some private loan people and got what's known as private money. And I wrote them like an agreement putting up collateral. And then I took the money and I renovated the houses, the house that I had at the time, and I was able to raise all the rents. I had a 3-family house. It's in Brooklyn. It's 508 Lafayette Avenue, Bedford, Lafayette Avenue, 508 Lafayette Avenue, Brooklyn, New York, 11205. Look it up. I bought that house in 2007, June or July. Now the good thing is this is the good part. It was tough for me in 2008 or so. I think it was 2008 or 9. I can't remember exactly what it was when I went to the bankruptcy guy, but I'd had the house for probably a year, maybe 2 years. It was tough for me at the time. I was like, man, I could just easily walk away from this debt. The house was worth hundreds of thousands less than I make, and I make $50,000 a year at the time as a fireman. And I had a job as a bartender, so I was making pretty good money at that too. But what happened was all my tenants moved out at the same time. The area was somewhat high crime, and one of my tenants got punched in the face. She had an iPhone. She got punched in the face, and she was just scared to go back to the house. Her friend lived in the other floor. She was like, I'm out too. So all of a sudden I went from having 2 tenants, mortgage was paid, everything was cool, to having 0 tenants. And it was a tough time financially in Brooklyn. And there were a lot of new construction places that were open that people couldn't rent, so they were dropping their rents. So they were competing with my apartments, which were rough around the edges. And that's, so it was somewhat extenuating circumstances. So long story short though, in 2017, I sold that house for over $1.79 million. And I bought it for $700,000. And there was a point when I was collecting about $11,000 a month of rent from that place. Because the first floor, I was renting to a short-term rental guy for corporate. So he would rent it to like executives, and it was furnished. And the second and third floors, I did the same thing. So eventually I was just crushing it with that. I was crushing it. How did I do that? Luck. I just was reading about short-term rentals, corporate rentals. I had some tenants move out, so I was like, hey, let me contact this guy. So I contacted this dude in Brooklyn, and he was like, oh yeah, I have insurance people who like say there was a fire in their house and the insurance company has to put them up. They'll pay any price to get these people a house the next day. They have renter's insurance, those people. So that was one tenant, and another tenant was like some dude from Europe who was an executive making $500,000 a year. So I was just crushing it with this house. My mortgage was about maybe like $4,000 a month with taxes, insurance, everything included. Everybody was paying their own utilities. I was making $7,000 a month off this house doing nothing. So then I sold it for $1.7 million. And you know, that's really good. So I started another real estate business up with that. I ended up buying like probably close to 50, 60 rentals in Newburgh, New York. 222 Broadway. Spit it out. Look that up. 222 Broadway in Newburgh, New York. 50 Lutheran, Newburgh, New York. 103 Renwick, Newburgh, New York. 101 or 100 Renwick, Newburgh, New York. 156, 156. No, 150. I can't remember the address anymore. Another building number, 163, 165 Broadway, Newburgh, and then another address on Ann Street. And then I had a bunch more houses, 156 South Street, just a ton of houses around that neighborhood. So I bought all these houses and I paid a pretty good price for them, but I made some mistakes. I did some dumbass stuff. And I ended up getting myself in a terrible situation financially. I was paying 12% a month in interest on 7 figures. And I had some problems with some tenants. I had some tenants who were selling drugs and I was throwing them out. I had this little thing happen with the cops, where the cops came to me and told me this dude was selling drugs in my house. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. So I tried to evict him, but it wasn't really working. And he was a crafty little guy, and he had a good lawyer, and he was fighting me to the death legally. So you know, and I was ready to fight him to death, literally. But he also had a little bit of, you know, he had that kind of help from some of his friends. So I really was in a tough position, you know, and when you're in a tough position, you get creative. So I threw some cameras on the building. I made some copies of keys. I went to the Newburgh City Police Department and explained to them what was going on. I mean, they already knew what was going on because they weren't told me there were drug dealers in the building. But I talked to some undercover agents, whatever. They were like, we'd love to get this guy. So I put all those cameras in. They started vandalizing the cameras. I gave the cops keys to the building. I did all kinds of stuff, but eventually, through hook or crook, I won. Because one day, there was a helicopter above my building, an armored car, 2 armored cars, about 20 cop cars, and maybe 50, 60 cops, some of them with M16s and automatic weapons. They blasted through this guy's apartment. He had a bunch of drug dealers and there were guns and shit like that. And they threw his ass out, which was good for me. But unfortunately, he moved into another apartment in that building shortly thereafter with not himself, but some of his associates moved into another apartment in that building. So then I had to throw those people out because they allowed him to come into the apartment. Next thing you know, it's almost completely empty, the building. Went from making like $6,000, $7,000 a month down to like $2,000, which wasn't making the mortgage on that one building. Then I got myself in a lawsuit with a friend of mine. I have a business partner, his name was Michael, and we had a disagreement financially, which occurs. You know, he has his story, I have my story. Eventually, him and I, years later, worked our lawsuit out, and I paid him more than I wanted to pay him, more than I thought he was owed, but I always knew I owed him some money. Just we disagreed over the amount. It was a 6-figure amount. Like say I thought I owed the guy 120, he says you owe me 360. He only had receipts for about 120, so that's kind of why I felt he only owed 120. But anyway, moving along, I got in a situation where I knew I wasn't gonna be able to make my payments. You know, I could see the handwriting on the wall. It was 3 to 6 months down the road. I was just gonna hit the wall and, you know, I wasn't gonna make payments. I had a lot of loans. I had one loan for $1 million. I had a couple of loans for 200, 250, a couple of loans for 100. I had, you know, a couple $1 million worth of loans. You know, I had like 60 units at this point, and I could just see I was gonna lose the whole thing. So I started putting stuff up for sale. But before I did that, I went to see a bankruptcy attorney again, and I talked to him, and I basically just told him the same story. And he's like, because I had hard money loans, and they were personally guaranteed, but the hard money guys were my friends, and they told me, they go, we never chase anybody down. He goes, if you walk away from these loans, as long as it's, you know, he's like, basically, we're gonna take the building from you and we're gonna sell it. And he goes, if you have a lot of cash left over someplace, we'll go after that. He's like, but if it's just your house, you know, and your personal bank account with personal money in it, he's like, we're not gonna go after you. So he's like, you know, keep it under advisement that we don't have a track record of going after private individuals for their own personal home. He's like, can't make any promises, but that's what I would say. So even though I talked to the bankruptcy lawyer, even though I heard that I would be able to easily walk away from this with no loss of home, because I lived in a home at the time in Chappaqua, New York, and my home in Chappaqua, New York, it's nothing like the home that I grew up in the Bronx. I didn't really grow up in a home in the Bronx. I grew up in a basement apartment next to the garbage cans, but you know, Chappaqua, where we lived, was a far cry from 29 Helena Drive. Look that up. I bought that house in 2017, 2016. I sold it in 2022. That was another one. I bought that for about the same amount of money as the place in Brooklyn, about 700 grand. And I sold it again for 1.7 million. I did good with that one too. That one I made some good money off of. But the thing is when all this bankruptcy stuff was going on, I was like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to move out of Chappaqua. We might have to move back to the basement apartment in the Bronx where I grew up, which my wife would not be cool with. So we probably would move into her parents' basement. But anyway, long story short, this is what was swirling around, and I'm still working in the fire department, but by now I'm making 6 figures at the fire department. I'm making $120,000 a year. So I'm not, we're not starving. I never bought a brand new car. I had never owned a brand new car at that point in my life. And I'm sitting there in the bankruptcy attorney's office like I got $3-4 million worth of real estate, $5 million worth of real estate for real. At one point I had like $6 million worth of real estate, all cash flowing at the time, but I could see that, the expenses were going like this and the revenues were going like this. And eventually, when they get far enough apart, it's a bad time. So I sat there in his office, I talked to him, I gave him the same spiel I gave the first guy. He gave me his spiel first, I gave him my spiel. I said, listen man, I owe plumbers, I owe electricians, I owe credit card companies, I owe community banks, I owe friends, I owe family, I owe my father-in-law, I owe my wife's company, I owe, and he goes, okay, so who are you gonna pay? I'm like, I'm gonna pay everybody. And he's like, well, what about the bank that has the loans? I go, well, that's a hard money loan. It's my guys, man. So what I'll probably do is I'll probably start small after they take back everything from me, and I'll pay them back one day. I'll start with one house again, and I'll make all the money back, and eventually I'll just pay them back every penny I owe them. He's like, well, then bankruptcy is not an option for you. He goes, you should just sell what you can, take your losses, and make terms with your debt, with your people who own your debt, and say you will pay them off. So I said, okay, that's what I'll do. Fortunately, Slick Rick over here was able to walk away from all those real estate transactions, 100% paid down all debt, except the contractor who I was fighting with, my friend Mike, who we're arguing with, not fighting with. We didn't physically get into a fight, but me and him were arguing. So he was the only person, but I had cleared almost $1 million from all these real estate transactions. So at the closings, I had almost $1 million, but they took $360 and put it in an escrow account because he said I owed him $360. I felt it was $120. He ended up getting around $220 or something like that, I think. Maybe he got 3. Yeah, he might have gotten 3. He got paid way too much, that dude. But that's okay. I make a lot more money than him anyway, so I'm okay with it. But so anyway, long story short, I walked away a free man. I paid the plumbers. I paid the electricians. I paid the concrete guys. I paid the utility companies. Actually, the utility company just sent me a bill recently for $1,500. I'm like, what are you, crazy? So I got to look at that one. I might owe them. I've been talking to customer service about it. I feel like I paid everything because that was like 4 years ago, and utility company doesn't really mess around. So now they sent me a bill. I think what they're doing is they didn't shut my service off. They let it run on somebody else's account, and now they're trying to chase me down for that. But I made sure to shut every one of those accounts down before I left. So what was I saying? Oh, so I ended up being at the closing table of the last transaction in early 2020, walking away with 6 figures plus the $360 was in the bank that we will fight over for a few more years. We just settled about a year ago. And so what I'm going to say here is this. If bankruptcy is good for your family, you might lose your house if you don't do bankruptcy, and it's something that you think is going to put your family in a good position, then go ahead and do it. Feel okay. As long as you didn't set out to say, hey man, if things go wrong, I'm just going to go bankrupt, who cares? You're fine. Take bankruptcy. But if you could see in the future a glimmer of hope of you paying all of those people back and getting whole again, it is kind of nice to be able to say, my name is John Hickey, John A. Hickey. I have lived in Florida, Houston, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, and New York State, and bankruptcy records are publicly available, and you can find mine if I have one. It is kind of nice to be able to say that. I like that. And I've been in some situations where most people will go bankrupt. I'm telling you right now. I've been in some situations where people would be like, let me pull that bankruptcy lever. Because it is an easier, softer way to get out of trouble. You know what I mean? They'll let you take your car sometimes. They'll let you take your house sometimes. You know what I mean? They're not coming after your personal possessions. Whereas if you don't go bankrupt, you have to pay that money back. Otherwise your credit is shot for life. And I took dings on credit because I did make some credit card payments late. I had to choose. I chose to make the credit card payments late instead of not paying the electricians and the plumbers because they got families right there. I know there's a person on the other side of the credit card. I chose to make the hard money payments and the mortgage payments, as opposed to making the credit card payments. I had some obligations to friends and family, like my dad, my father-in-law, my wife's company, and I chose to put those off because I spoke to them and they said it was okay with them for the moment, and so I chose to put those off a little while later. But eventually I was able to pay everybody back. It's a really good feeling. You know, if you had to go through bankruptcy and you want to do what I did, which is feel like right now, what you could do is search down those people who you owe money to and pay them off. And that's a good way to do it, man, I'm telling you. Because then you could be like, yo, I did go bankrupt, but here, I got a letter from this guy. I owed him 100 grand. I paid him. So I did go bankrupt, but eventually I did take care of it. Because I always feel like if you incur a debt, you need to pay it back. Thanks for listening to the Old Man at DTC.